In the first segment where we were talking about information and behavioral control, this was about, does the company have the right strategy, and how do we get everybody on the team to execute that strategy? The idea of corporate governance is a little bit different, and that focuses really at the very top echelon of the corporation. And it says, in essence, are they really serving the corporation's best interests? This is something I'd never thought about before, but the modern corporation is a little bit of an aberration with the economic relationships in history. Namely, we've separated the owners and the managers in many cases, although you could say it did exist back when you had kings and they had divvied out fiefdoms and those sorts of things. Because you have the owners of the company, that would be the shareholders. They get a couple of good deals in the modern corporation. Namely, they can only lose the amount of money that they put into the corporation. So if we look at, for example, some of the most recent bankruptcy proceedings with American Airlines, the good news is nobody can go to a shareholder of American Airlines and say, you've got to kick in an extra $50 per share to cover the debts as a part of the bankruptcy settlement. Can't happen. You have a limited liability to what's been invested into the corporation. Gives you the opportunity to share in the profits, but in keeping with the limited liability, there's limited participation in the actual leadership of the company, which obviously differs from privately held companies, where usually there's a very concentrated ownership, or even if it's, say, a family business where there's only one owner and they're the person that's also managing it. So let's go talk about the management for just a minute. So they're charged with the day-to-day operation of the company, but in most cases, particularly for publicly traded companies, they don't own much, if any, of the company. So in essence, they become just another employee, hired to do a job. Your job just happens to be the strategic leadership of this corporation. And because shareholders probably don't have the time in large publicly traded corporations to pay much attention to what the management is doing, and they don't have the ability to speak as a consistent and coherent voice, board of directors are created. So what is a board of directors? It is a panel established to represent who? The shareholders. The shareholders. The board's fiduciary responsibility is to the shareholders. And there have been times in the recent past where board members have been sued by shareholders saying, in essence, they didn't represent my best financial interests. Therefore, they breached their fiduciary responsibility. We'll talk about the reality of board relationships in a couple of minutes. But you're about to see this time of year, this topic gets pretty hot because companies tend to hold their annual meetings in the spring and in the summer, and there's going to be a lot of talk about voting out slates of directors, bringing in new directors, those sorts of things because of performance issues. Because there's a separation between the ownership and the management of the company, in Chuck Bultina's class, you've already probably been briefly introduced to the idea of agency theory, which says that the owners, the principals, have a problem with the agents, that would be the managers, in making sure that they actually do what they're supposed to do, which is act in the owner's best interest. There are two principal ways they say that they differ. One is on goals. At first you would think, what? How could their goals differ? And for the most part, they don't. But here's one area where it turns into a rub, where goals can seem to differ, if not consciously, then subconsciously. CEOs and the senior officers as employees of the company may tend to do things that treat the employees of the company, at least the top employees of the company, very well because they can. So this is the argument you get into about the private jets, the country club memberships, the cars, all the perks, if you will, that go with running a major corporation. Do we really need to pay for that? Is that really in the company's best interest? Does the CEO of Ford Motor need this huge corner office with expensive furniture and a big building and a fleet of executive assistants to help him? Or does he do that just to make his life better and because he can? So there's where the goals may diverge. Interestingly enough, the idea is that in some cases, CEOs may be more risk averse than the share owners are, because the CEO doesn't want to lose his job or her job, but a wise shareholder has diversified their holdings across a portfolio and somewhat encourage risk taking among the companies so that on average the performance of their portfolio will be good, even if there are a couple of failures in there where the company in essence goes out of business. CEOs tend not to want to have their companies go out of business because first of all they lose their job, and secondly, when you lose your job under those terms, it's pretty hard to find another one. So much of what you hear in the discussion on corporate governance is we need to watch those crafty CEOs to make sure they're doing what we tell them to be doing. And the more kinder, gentler way that we say that is we work to align their interests. And typically where they seek to align their interests is through the idea of compensation. There are other perks issues, and I've touched on those briefly in the previous slide, but so much attention gets paid to CEO pay. And again, you're going to see a lot of attention on this because there's even certain rights to say on pay that the U.S. Congress has been playing around with for the past couple of years. This idea of the top 1% make too much money and they take it away from everybody else. As shareholders, they really ought not get too into that debate. They should be more focused on, is this person delivering value for the salary we're paying them, and should we throw them out and bring in somebody maybe at a lower salary that's going to deliver on the value and isn't going to be as expensive. We'll talk more in class when we come together, but the idea of CEO pay gets really complicated because you have, in many cases, a CEO's compensation is only in part their salary, and not just in part their salary, it's often a small part. So you have things like stock options, which allows them to buy a stock at a certain price. You have restricted stock where they're given stock, but they're not allowed to sell it for X period of time, and just flat cash bonuses. So it's not just how much does the CEO get paid, but how does the CEO get paid? And you're going to hear a lot of different philosophies on that. The idea of, well, stock options, they motivate a person to really grow so that the stock grows and it becomes worth more. The idea of restricted stock is that it's good to motivate and to incentivize the CEOs for the long term. They can't sell their stock for 5 years after it's been given to them as in a stock grant. So they're more motivated to make sure that the company is going to do well over the long haul. And the cash bonuses are just the cleanest, and it's the clearest. You performed here, this is what you get paid. And again, we're going to talk more about that when we come together. Here's one of the really big rubs about pay for performance kind of systems. What should performance be tied to? I think the textbook really commits a grave error when they talked about the section of the Ford's CEO's pay, because frankly they proved the point. They talked about a year where this Ford CEO got paid a relatively large bonus, and that CEO was Alan Mulally, the former Boeing executive, one of the first quote-unquote outsiders, read non-car guy or non-car girl, to run a major U.S. Auto manufacturer. It made fun of the fact that he got a big bonus for losing $1 billion less than was expected. Like, why in the world would a guy deserve a bonus when the company's losing money? Knock, knock, knock. Hello, what are we thinking here? Well, let's think about this for a second. If you're a shareholder in Ford, in 2008 and early 2009, what happened to the other major companies? GM, bankruptcy. Chrysler, bankruptcy. Of late, Toyota, really underperforming. So suddenly the idea of only losing several $1 billion, such that my company didn't have to declare bankruptcy, that looks pretty good uh, for a shareholder. So this idea of performance, do you just tie it to certain fixed goals in the future, or do you say, for example, 2008, 2009 was a terrible year in our industry. On average, the average corporation lost 25% of its stock value. We only lost 10% of our stock value, and we think it's because of the CEO. Does that person deserve a reward even though the stock price went down? I'd say they do. So you see, it gets really complicated pretty quickly in this whole debate. And then you get into the idea of CEO tenure. Do you have to pay short-term CEOs different than long-term CEOs? That's a good topic. But you also get into this idea of CEO tenure, on average, is shorter now than it's been in recent history, which is to say they're able to stay in the seat for a shorter period of time. And once they've been let go, they're damaged goods, and it's harder to find a job. So there's that tendency, as the tenures get shorter, what do CEOs want to do? They want to make a lot of money while they're in the saddle, so to speak, because they know it's a bucking bronc. I might not stay here very long, and if I get thrown, it's unlikely I'm going to get another chance to ride a horse. The next issue is, to what extent do you believe the CEO, and we'll include in that the senior officers, are really responsible for the performance? Do they have that big of a role? We're going to debate that issue a little bit later, but if you say to yourself, this is not a situation where I saw the CEO having a lot of impact, then they should neither participate in the upside in terms of getting big options if performance was great, nor should they necessarily get whacked if performance wasn't great, because they didn't have that big of an impact. Another touchy issue is, how much more money does the CEO deserve than the chief financial officer, the chief operating officer, the chief technical officer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In most corporations, that gap is pretty big, frankly. Like, usually the CEO makes more than double, in many cases, way more than double, what the second highest paid executive makes. Is that appropriate? Well, maybe. It probably depends on the relationship and the culture you want between the senior officers. And then you have to ask yourself, and this is one that's very counterintuitive, is this idea of pay for performance really fair, particularly when they tie it into the stock options in terms of a big part of the compensation? So what we have is whereas the owners of the company can be highly diversified in what they do financially with their investments, where's the CEO and the senior officers? They are all into the company. Their pay's there, their stock options are there, they're really concentrated. And is that fair to them to have their compensation be so clearly tied to firm performance when nobody else's is? And again, you can debate that. Now, here's the interesting thing. This idea of pay for performance and CEO agency and all that other stuff has been a hot topic for probably close to 20 years now. And the stuff I'm going to tell you is relatively dated, but I've seen some recent research that tends to track with this. And that is, when they examine the performance of companies that put in these pay for performance sorts of pay packages where they think the performance of the CEO is closely aligned with the interest of the share owner, they don't see any difference between companies that don't have as tight of alignment. So all that discussion is about agency and we've got to align and all that other stuff. Frankly, there's not a lot of evidence to say that you really do need to, that people do a better job when they're quote unquote paid for performance. Anytime you're looking at firm performance and you're trying to tease out a particular effect of something, that's a really tough thing to do because there's so many things that are affecting firm performance. But I personally find it interesting that to date, the results have said we really don't see much of an impact. And the reason for that is a small crying voice in the wilderness says agency theory isn't everything it's made up to be. There's this concept of stewardship theory, which is why not hire people that you think are going to be motivated to do a good job and compensate them fairly. I personally think there's a lot to be said for that. That said, in the real world, you realize, though, there needs to be controls and those sorts of things, because CEOs do go amok. Even good people get, they kind of lose their ethical compass. I don't want to make it as dramatic as they're doing unethical things, but they are migrating towards it's good for me. Is it really good for the company? So I'm in favor of keeping a close eye on that, but personally, I'm in favor of, we expect you to do a good job. And if you aren't, if you don't have the country's best or company's best interest at heart, move along. We'll bring in the next guy or gal. And whose job is it to bring in that next guy or gal? Well, that's the board of directors. So you see the three major things that the board of directors is responsible for. In the past, they've probably not done a great job of this, but they've getting a lot of attention on these issues. And then two, a really good board is there to provide advice and counsel. The criticism of boards is they tend to just rubber stamp what the CEO wants to do. And that's certainly true. I've been on the periphery of some bank boards, none here in Wichita Falls, okay? Make that very clear, I'm not talking about anybody here. And it's real clear that the bank directors were put there to be rubber stamped for what the bank president or CEO wants to do. They're all his or her friends, and I've had bank presidents just tell me straight up, I'm looking for a board that respects the fact that I know the industry and they don't. Pretty clear that they're not looking for the board to tell them much of anything. So you see sometimes that the boards don't do a very good job. Those of you that had me in entrepreneurship know that a good board of directors can be critical, particularly to startups, in terms of getting you the resources that you need to get things off the ground, because they can pick up the phone and you can use their social network in addition to the CEO's social network to get stuff done. Because there has been so much criticism of boards of directors, there's been a lot of research in what makes for a good board of directors. They're active, needless to say. They're independent, and this is really key and tricky all at the same time. The reason it's key is you don't want people that are just rubber stamping what the CEO wants, or frankly are motivated based on their own personal self-interest to make decisions that serve the CEO's interests at the sacrifice of the company's best interest. And in the textbook, they had a couple of really great examples of where you read these directors and you know they're not going to do anything contrary to what the CEO wants them to do, because they're tied to them either because they're in the company, which would be an inside director if a person's an officer of the company, or they're personally tied to the CEO. So although they seem like they are an outside, or I'm sorry, an outside or independent director, they're really not, because they're friends with so-and-so. And then you get the idea of interlocking. So there was a while when Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, at that time the CEO of Google, sat on Apple's board of directors. Would that relationship tend to ratchet down the competition between Google and Apple? Would Eric Schmidt say things in the board of directors meeting for Apple that would be good for Google, even if they weren't great for Apple? And eventually, those ties became so strained, Schmidt left the Apple board. So there's this idea of, if I get people inside the industry to sit on the board, whose interest are they really furthering through their board's decisions? But does that mean I have to hire people who don't know anything about the industry? That doesn't seem terribly attractive either. The next step is they're saying it's good if the director owns a good chunk of company stock. And you can see where that makes sense. This is the whole idea of aligning the interests. I'm going to make decisions that are good for the company because, oh, by the way, it's good for me. I own a lot of stock. What's curious about this is that restricts the number of people that can serve on your board of directors, because they've got to be wealthy to buy a good chunk of your company stock. And is that necessarily what you want? Might there be some people that would be very effective board of directors members that are not millionaires on their own right, or are not willing to take their $200,000 or $300,000 or $400,000 and put it all into one company stock so they can be a director for the company? The last couple of points I think are relatively self-explanatory. Well, like I said, things haven't all been pink and rosy on the board of directors front, and that certainly changed with Sarbanes-Oxley, started to change with Sarbanes-Oxley, when people on the board became responsible for the accuracy of the financial statements. As you would expect, as the law changed to make directors more responsible for the performance of the company on whose boards they sit, the turnover of directors goes up. People like to sit on boards in part because they're paid well for doing very little money, paid well for doing very little work. It's prestigious. It's kind of like an inner club. But when you see people with significant net worth, they may not want to be on a board because they don't want the liability exposure that provides to them. And Sarbox has heightened the liability that they bear. By the same token, it's heightened their responsibilities and their fiduciary responsibility. Then we get to the question, should the board chairman and the CEO be the same person? We're going to talk about that in class, so I'm not going to go any further with that one. And then lastly, one specific thing that has been identified with boards of directors is who sits on the compensation committee. These are the people that sets the CEO pay. Some of the egregious things that have been found is where you have the CEOs of similar companies, not competitors, but similar companies that sit on the compensation committee. Why is that a bad idea? Well, they vote a pay raise for the CEO of that company, and this person goes along, which raises the overall level of CEO compensation in the industry, and then that person goes back to their board and say, hey, I think I deserve a raise. Look, the CEO over there in company X just got a $10 million raise. What about me? And in reality, they were instrumental in the CEO in company X getting a $10 million raise. So there's a relatively unholy alliance on those sorts of things as well. The last participant is the shareholder. Notice I've been switching back and forth in my terms between shareholder and share owner. A lot of stuff today says they're really shareholders, which is to say they don't care about the company. They may not even know much about the company. They're just in it for a quick buck, make your stock price go up so I can get richer and go from there. We're going to talk about that in a couple of minutes on this slide, but we have to recognize that's an issue. But let's assume for now that people really act as share owners who have the long-term interest of the company at heart. There are a couple of issues that really make the share owners relatively powerless in this game. The first is that the concentration of shareholders in most publicly traded companies is incredibly small. Go to just about any major corporation and look at the concentration of shareholders, and you'll see a couple of the major mutual funds, Vanguard, Fidelity, that will own 3 or 4% of a company stock, and that's the single largest holder. So there isn't like there's somebody that's got 30% of the stock and somebody else that's got another 30% of the stock, and if they decide, those two people decide what to do, then boy, what she says goes, because they voted and they've got 60% between them. On the flip side of that, though, is that the participation and the proxies and the voting, that sort of thing, tends to be fairly low. So relatively small shareholders, when I say relatively small, I mean they may hold 1, 2, 3, 4% of the company. This goes back to that power, urgency, legitimacy model we talked about with the firing of Robert Nardelli. Well, if they can get enough people to go along and go to the annual meeting, it takes a relatively small number of the shareholders, percentage of the shareholders, to get certain things done because the overall participation is relatively low. I got to confess, I get those black envelopes from my broker that's got my proxies to vote in this election and vote for these directors and all that other stuff. When I was younger, I did. And then I figured out, it was like mine's 1 out of a gazillion vote. And I don't really understand these issues. I'm not voting anymore, so I don't. And that's why you see other people perhaps stepping up to the plate. The time horizon, I've really already alluded to that. There's a sense of shareholders, hey, we're just renting the company. We're not really owning it. We should not be treated like owners. But there are some entities that are taking relatively big positions and holding them for a while. Mutual fund companies. And so in the textbook, it talked about when CalPERS, the California retirement system, put in procedures, that would be obviously in the pension accounts, things changed. A lot of people have been pushing the mutual fund companies to be less passive in how they vote the shares that they own, because remember, you own shares in a mutual fund company. It's the mutual fund that goes out and buys the actual shares of stock. So the mutual fund companies, in reality, are usually the voters, if you will, in the shareholders' elections. And because they do own large blocks, and because they perhaps do know other mutual fund companies that own large blocks, when they move, they can have an impact. Hedge funds, same thing. If you can buy a position of 5 to 10%, you can exert a lot of influence. Independents are just those people like, say, T. Boone Pickens, that like to come into companies. Carl Icahn is the name of another rater. They'll just come in and they'll buy up quietly 7 or 8% of the stock and say, "Hello, Mr. CEO, we need to talk because I'm not happy with the way you're doing business." And Icahn and others are famous for voting to get their own voting to get their own people on the board of directors and those sorts of things. So even though a lot of trends make shareholders kind of passive and just at the mercy of management, who frequently has co-opted the board of directors, I think you're seeing the pendulum shift back towards the share owners for these reasons. And even though we've talked about all three of the people that participate in corporate governance, there are other people, though, that do exert corporate control. One is the unsolicited takeover. So the shareholders are fat, dumb, and unhappy, but not angry enough to do anything about it. The board's asleep at the switch because they've been bought off by the management. Management stinks, and the stock price is in the tank. That might describe, at least stock price, some of your all stock prices in BSG. And so now somebody that's flush with cash can step in and say, "We're buying you up," and you're all fired. And that worries CEOs, particularly when they're in negative performance situations. So that is one form of corporate control. And then you have people like auditors, banks, and analysts, independent people who are looking at what's going on, and they're forming their own judgments about the company. So, for example, if you have an analyst that goes negative on a stock, it can have devastating impact on the stock price if it's a respected analyst, someone that's listened to. So they, in essence, get a voice in your company, how it's governed, because they're so influential. Obviously, the regulators, SEC is but one example, can have a big deal on how it's managed. And then you also see just the power of the media. As I make this tape, this past week, Tim Cook, the new CEO of Apple, was touring the Chinese factories where Apple's products are manufactured. And Apple's been getting a lot of heat in the press about how their employment practices and the people they contract to are not in keeping with what's expected of a market leader. So there's an example of that company being controlled by people who aren't share owners, board, or the management itself. This brings the topic to an end. We're going to have a good discussion in class. Remember that you're supposed to work on either the Avon issues or the Yahoo issues, and tell us what you think about the corporate governance that's happening in those firms. And I'll be interested in what you have to say. We'll talk about this some more, have a lot of interesting things to do in class. I'll see you on Wednesday night.